Okay, so yeah, welcome everyone. Nice to see you all again. So today, as Phil says, it's a back to basics session where we're going to look at the next two stages of the risk management process. So that'll be risk identification and risk evaluation. For those of you who missed the first session covering objectives and communications, the recording of that session can be found on our website, but we'll maybe include it as well if we can when we send today's recording out, so that you've got both parts. So just before we get started, when you filled in your registration, we asked what line of defence you sat in, and many of you said that you weren't sure. So I thought I'd just share a couple of slides to go through the very basics of the three lines of defence again, just very briefly, so that you can have a look. For those of you who aren't sure, you might sort of find out where you sit. So the three lines model is based upon dividing up the risk management responsibilities around different groups of people in the organisation. And it's a way of explaining that relationship between all the risk management functions. So different parts of the organisation will play different roles in risk management, and the interaction between those roles will really determine just how well you deal with risk as a whole. I'll keep knocking my other camera. So the implementation of the three lines model is not simple, but like most things, there are benefits to be had, such as better allocation of risk ownership, the removal of duplication of work. And when done properly, it should provide a better risk culture and improve that risk reporting. So these are the three lines in more detail. So the first line is all about operational management. So these will be those of you who are in roles who own and manage risks and probably controls as well. But on a daily basis, you're responsible for identifying and assessing and the risks and implementing any controls. So these first line people normally have a good knowledge of the relevant policies and procedures. They have a good understanding of the organisation and its objectives. And all of that together will help maintain that risk culture. So the first line of defence of those of you at the front line of the business normally. So the second line of defence are the risk management and compliance teams, those of you who specialise in the compliance and oversight of the risk management. You're the ones setting the policies, defining the frameworks, tools and techniques to support those of your colleagues on the first line. And the second line helps to ensure that consistency of risk management processes, so providing direction and training and reporting up to senior management as well. And where resources allow, and it doesn't always happen, but where resources allow, that second line should be absolutely independent of the first line. Sometimes that doesn't happen, but that's really there to prevent that conflict of any interest. And then finally, you have the third line, and this truly is independent of the other two lines. And it normally comprises the internal audit function. And they're there to provide the assurance to senior management on quality and effectiveness of the risk management processes. So I'm hoping those of you who weren't sure where you sat within those three lines, hopefully you'll have some idea, certainly something to take away and think about. But I say it's a very, very basic look at it. There's lots of different models and there's a lot more detail if you want to do some more research about that. So on the last Back to Basics webinar, we'll, for those of you who came along, we looked at the first two areas of the risk management process. We looked at objectives and goals and communication and consultation, which takes place throughout the whole process, which is why it's sitting in the middle there. So today we're going to look at the next two parts of the risk management process, so risk identification and risk evaluation. So firstly, risk identification. So let's go back to the beginning again. What's risk? Well, risk could be anything that we worry about, anything that keeps us awake at night. What are we continuously thinking about in our own areas of work? So in layman's terms, a risk could be described as a potential future event that could affect us achieving our goals or work objectives. So an operational risk could be something that results in a loss of some kind. That could be due to failed internal processes or a system failure, for example. Strategic risks could be anything that affects your whole organisation. So it could be something like failure to retain staff or the failure of a major contract. But thinking about our personal lives, a risk event could be anything around sort of major events that take place, like buying a new car or a new house, for instance. Those things that you worry about, what if they go wrong? So basically at work or at home, we're dealing with risks pretty much every day, and we probably don't even realise we're going through that risk management process of ourselves in our heads. So this might be a little obvious to some of you, but I think it's worth taking a few minutes for those of you that are new to risk. It's about when we think about risk, we have to think about what may stop us reaching our objectives and what would happen if it did happen. So this is what I would suggest when articulating risks. So think about it like this. So as a result of this could happen, resulting in this. So as a result of a cause, a risk event could happen, resulting in a consequence. So this is where we have our risk, cause and consequence. And I've got a couple of examples here for you as well. So as a result of prolonged staff sickness, there's a lack of skills in the office, meaning that we could fail to deliver our services. And there's another one. As a result of broken locks, the tiger escapes from his cage, meaning that a member of the public could get injured, or the tiger could. So you'll see there, I've colour coded it. So you can see there the cause, the risk event, and the consequence. So many of you have seen this before, but what risk do we have here? So our little mouse here, he wants to eat his cheese. That's his goal. His objective is to get that cheese. However, with eating that cheese comes a huge risk in the form of a mousetrap. So he needs to decide how much he really wants that cheese. How much risk is he going to take in order to get it? And it may, of course, depend on how hungry he is. So how much appetite has he got? Well, he's fairly hungry, quite determined. He's bought himself a little crush helmet. And if he wears his crush helmet, still goes for the cheese, but any resulting injury may be less than if he doesn't wear the crush helmet. So the impact of injury may be less, but the probability of him getting injured is going to be pretty much the same. So as per the previous slide, to articulate this risk, it would be something like, as a result of the mouse being hungry and taking the cheese, the cause, the trap will go off, which is the risk event, resulting in an injury to the mouse, which is the consequence. So once you've realised what your goals are, now's the time to be thinking about what risk events would stop you from achieving them. So this is your risk identification. And this is where a good team discussion could take place. So risk assessment workshops, surveys, mind mapping, all those sort of things. They can all come in really handy at this point. You can discuss any potential future events that could happen, identify any risks that would cause the most adverse impact on you, and also the ones that are most likely to materialise. So you're looking for any risks that may be evident in your discussions. So a simple example, you decide you want to sail to France for lunch. So this is your objective. You may also be a keen canoeist. It's a bright sunny day, so your first instinct may be just to grab your canoe, find your friends, and off you go. What could possibly go wrong? So although your goal may be to have lunch in France, you probably wouldn't get there in a canoe. A canoe surely isn't big enough to get across the channel. So the first risk may be, what if your canoe sinks? But then what would cause that? It could be high tidal waves, it could be bad weather mid-channel, or it could just be that your canoe simply isn't big enough for the job. Another risk may be that you get lost. This may be because you haven't got a compass or a map on board, or maybe as simple as you just haven't done your homework before setting off. So let's relate that back to your organisation. So a risk could be things like loss of funding for staff, and there may be a backlog of work, which is causing a rise in customer complaints. So this is a stage where you really think about what could happen to stop you achieving your goals. So think about this risk, what could happen? So firstly, yeah, this could happen. Your boat could sink quite easily, and the consequence could be lifeguards, injury, all sorts of things. So suddenly your nice lunch in France has turned into a rescue mission because you didn't think about it before you set off, and therefore your original objective wasn't reached. There's 4 types of risks. We just have a quick look at these for you to think about. So we have compliance risks, we have hazard risks, control risks, and opportunity risks. And here's a little example of each in relation to the risk around buying a car, which shows that there can be many risks when owning a car. Again, we probably don't really think about them daily, but we do adhere to them. So when you're buying a new car, your hazard risk then may be that you possibly buy too much for it. You might buy a second-hand car, and when you get home or a few months later, you realise it was in a poorer condition than you first thought. Your compliance risks are around adequate car insurance. You have to have MOTs on most cars. Your control risks around your borrowing. So you might borrow a certain amount of money, your interest rates might go up, fuel prices go up all the time. And then you've got your opportunity risks. So the upside of owning cars might enhance your job opportunities. You might be able to drive further, it's save money on public transport, those sort of things. Makes it a lot easier for getting around. So once identified, you can classify your risks. And using a risk classification can provide a structure to your risk management, and it helps with generically identifying risks across your organisation. And the most common classification to use is PESTLE. This is very simple to use, helps you think about the wider environment and where those risks may come from. So first of all, you have P for political, and this could include any legislation or government guidance. E is economic. This is for risks around economic growth or decline. For example, the cost of living may be. Your S is your sociological risks, including anything around culture, ageing populations. T is technological, so anything around technology, so cyber risks or AI risks. L for legal speaks for itself really, but any risks again around legislation or directives. And then we have E for ethical and environmental. So these risks are mainly around ecological issues. The ethical has been added in more recent years to include things like corporate social responsibility. And the IRM has updated this classification to include separate areas of international and demographical risk. So you may also see PESTLE in some communications as well. So risk evaluation. So you've now identified your risk, you've now got to evaluate those risks. So risk evaluation is a critical component of risk management. It's the process of determining the significance of the risks that you've identified and deciding whether they're acceptable or whether they require further action. So evaluating risks allows us to gauge just how big that risk might be, giving us a good sense of scale so that we can decide what, if anything, we want to do to respond to it. And risk response is something I'll be covering in the next webinar in April. So most organisations find it useful to have a risk management framework against which to determine their impact and likelihood by way of tables. So for simple personal aims, it's probably quite easy to scale likelihood and impact without too much thought. We can consider how likely something is to happen based on our experience or the experience of others. And we can consider how severe the consequences might be based on knowledge. So if you think about, go back to our canoe across the channel, most of us would know that that would be a bad idea. And it would end badly, probably for most of us. So this is our sort of knowledge and our experience that we can also use in evaluating risk. So these tables are where we can score our risk using an impact and likelihood scale. we assess the likelihood of the risk happening in the first place, but then also what the impact or consequence would be. So here's just an example of those tables. You may have seen these within your organisation already, usually written, like I say, within your framework documentation. You can also see in these examples that definitions are given as to how to score likelihood, for instance. It gives a percentage probability and a sort of frame of reference, really, as to whether the risk has occurred before within the organisation or elsewhere. So again, it gives you that sort of knowledge or idea of how to score it. And the impact example here is considered from a few different perspectives to ensure that consideration is given to a full range of consequences. So rather than just thinking about, say, the financial implications, it's also good practice to consider all other impact categories which might be applicable, and not all of them are, of course, but to capture the risk score for each applicable category using any definitions that are in your tables. You would then take the highest score found, as that represents the most credible worst case scenario, whichever category the highest score is against. So the risk score you now have is then equal to the impact multiplied by the likelihood. So this is an example of a score of 8, where the impact is scored as 2. In this case, that's a minor in our example on the table there, and a 4 of likelihood, which is probable. So a strong possibility that this risk could happen, given the experience of other local governments in this example. So having a defined scale like this is useful to ensure that there's some consistency in understanding the impact of risk throughout the organisation, or the magnitude of it. Everyone, of course, has different perspectives and attitudes towards risk, but this gives some kind of generic process. So just to recap, the impact is how severely you'll be affected if the risk happens, and the likelihood is a probability of the risk event materialising in the first place. So just a few key aspects of risk evaluation. So understanding the significance. So risk evaluation goes beyond simply identifying potential hazard. It actually aims to understand the potential impact. So that involves considering the likelihood of the risk and the consequences. Determining acceptability is a key part of risk evaluation as well, where you're deciding the level of the risk and whether it's acceptable. And this often involves comparing evaluated risk against established risk criteria or tolerance levels within your organisation. And that criteria might vary depending on the context, such as industry regulations or company policies. Risk evaluation also acknowledges that risk perception can vary among individuals and groups. So factors such as emotions, values, past experiences, they can all influence how people perceive and respond to different risks. And of course, risk evaluation is just a phase within a wider risk assessment process, which we're covering in full on these Back to Basics webinars. So in our previous example of the risk that our canoe might capsize in bad weather, or we may hit rocks or run aground because we didn't do our homework before setting off, just shows that we really need to think about the risk beforehand. And if we took measures to minimise the likelihood of things going wrong, then we're more likely to achieve our final objective with little or no impact at all. So that's the end of the Back to Basics session. Just a few things to tell you. So our next risk webinar is going to be on the 15th of April. And that'll be part 3 of this session, of these sessions, looking at risk response, where I'll just go over mitigation planning. And in that webinar, we'll look at what our response to a risk may be or should be. Should we simply monitor it and keep an eye on it, or should we be taking additional actions to reduce the impact or likelihood? And if we're planning to take action, should we rescore the risk in any way? So that'll be part 3 on 15th of April. We also have a core user group meeting coming up. That's going to be in Cardiff. For those of you who can attend, it'll be great to see you. And we'll be sending out registration invites shortly on that. We also have a risk event planned for the 12th of June in London, where we'll be having a couple of speakers for you, along with a networking lunch. So hopefully we'll be able to see some of you there as well. And finally, for those of you who haven't yet completed our risk maturity scorecard, please do so if you get a chance. The QR code is there on the screen. But we'll be sending this slide deck out anyway, so you can do it then. But this scorecard will take you through about 20 quick questions on what you think the risk culture is like within your organisation. And that's based around the 4 Ns model of risk maturity. You'll then get the results emailed back to you along with some tips and tricks and actions to take to further embed that risk culture. So that's me. Back to Phil.
Thank you, Sandra. A great presentation again. It's nice to kind of have these things reiterated. Interesting enough, that scorecard, we launched it at the Alarm Southeast event, and it was interesting. People kind of completing it within, in a session, a break during the talk that Sandra gave, and people's perception of where they stand in terms of the maturity of their organisation, risk management, often quite different from what the resulting score was within the scorecard. So it's an interesting opportunity just to have a look. Anyway, just thanks for all of you for coming along again. It's great to see you again and have some interesting questions, which hopefully we've been able to answer. Sandra's given you some ideas of other events that are happening soon, and hopefully we'll meet up with you again soon. So enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks, guys. Take care now. Cheers.